So as David said, I'm Brent Wagner. I'm the executive director. I want to show my email address again at the end, and if I forget to say it, I welcome anything that we didn't get to today or thoughts that you had after the presentation. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me, but I will show that email address a little later. I think what a lot of you are interested in, quite appropriately, is the how a board certification exam would occur in a remote environment. So the idea being we had to institute this in 2021 to catch up from 2020 and address the concerns of the pandemic. But more important than that, I think, is really the background of why board certification exists. And I want to go through a little bit of this because it relates to an understanding of why we do what we do. I share our mission statement. It's, of course, on our website. This took us a full day to do. Actually, we started in the afternoon, I believe on a Tuesday, and Wednesday morning we were done by about lunchtime. So this was 25 people working for 8 hours to generate about 25 words worth of text. And believe it or not, it was a struggle, and it doesn't seem like it should be, but we really were trying to pin down, well, what is it the ABR actually exists to do? The initial iteration of this did not have the word patients in it. And a few of us sort of said, well, you know, without patients, there would be no need to have the ABR, right? It wouldn't be important for us to distinguish ourselves as radiologic professionals if we weren't concerned about the service to the public and the patients. And with that in mind, I think we came to exactly the right place, and that is to, number one, be very narrow in scope, but at the same time acknowledge that ultimately, although the candidates and diplomates of the ABR are integral to this process, ultimately we're trying to serve the patients and the public. And that's because there are professions that are different. And I would argue medicine is one of those. And if you're a radiologist or a medical physicist or a radiation oncologist, these really are, I believe, are professions that have an element of trust to them, and that is the public assumes that you're going to be doing the right thing in their interests, and that you're going to be striving to do absolutely the best that you can do. And by extension, then there's a sense of purpose around that as well. So I know some of this sounds a little bit like a cliche and a little too perhaps warm and fuzzy, but the reality is this separates the medical professions, I think, from some other professions that are you know, quite valid, but for us, this is sort of the core of what we do and why we do it, right? Why we come to work every day. Now, there's a history to board certification, and a lot of people, I confess, I didn't know this probably well into my practice. So not only during residency, but for several years beyond, it never occurred to me, well, why do boards exist? And a lot of people, myself included, didn't really understand this, that the boards weren't created by the government or a consumer group or even really generated by patients or the public. The boards were created by the professions themselves. And here's just an example from the American Board of Surgery's history. The ABR dates in 1934 were kind of in the middle of the pack. Some boards were formed a little earlier, some a little later. But this was at a time when medical professionals wanted to distinguish themselves. And as you see here, through virtue of their training experience and passing an examination, to be different, so that that a well-trained surgeon who was experienced and could pass the exam was different from somebody who just decided to call themselves a surgeon, because at that time, that's all you had to do. This quote comes from the American Board of Pediatrics, and they're just pointing out that if you wanted to be a pediatrician in the 20s, all you had to do was say, I'm a pediatrician, and you put a sign on your door, and you're all set. And of course, that's a good enough reason, I think, that if the boards didn't exist today, we should form them. We should form a board that would distinguish us, well-trained, experienced, knowledgeable professionals, from others who might be interested in providing that same service, whatever that service might be. Now, there are mistakes, though, the medical certification board, and this goes back, again, almost 100 years. What are the mistakes that a board might make? Because the problem is, with a well-recognized credential, which is board certification, there comes a certain amount of responsibility, and we hold that responsibility, right? We're going to have to be, I think, mindful of the expectations that the practitioners might have, and that would include ignoring the diplomates and the candidates, so ignoring the doctors that are involved in this. The second aspect of this is perhaps expecting too much of the professionals who we endeavor to certify. And then lastly, and this was, I confess, was given to me by the former CEO of the American Board of Medical Specialties when I asked a very pointed question, what mistakes do boards make? And she filled in this third one, and she said, expecting too little of the doctors. If you don't expect an amount that is credible to the public, and that is have certification standards that are somewhat rigorous, if it's not credible, it's not worth anything. It has no value, right? We can't just say, again, we'd be reverting almost back to that self-declared professional capacity or professional credential. And with that in mind, that's why we have somewhat rigorous standards, because that makes the certificate valid once it's issued. Now, what do we need to do as a board, though, as an organization beyond that? We need to be mindful of controlling costs, and we are. The governing board holds me accountable for keeping costs as low as we can while providing the service at the level that we need to. We need to be relevant, I think, not only at the diplomate level for continuing certification, but of course relevant for initial certification for the candidates who sit for our exams. I already mentioned we shouldn't be too demanding. That is, we can have high standards, but not onerous processes. We need to be reasonable in the way we execute the programs that go into board certification. And I've already mentioned this as well. We can't be too easy because, again, it starts to erode the value. Now, I would argue our biggest element right now is to enhance service. And for me, that is improving communication. So we need to be better at communicating. And I'll get back to this theme in a moment, that this really is our responsibility. It's not for the diplomates and candidates. There's a body of literature around the value of board certification. An awful lot of it relates to larger boards like internal medicine and family medicine. In fact, if you add internal medicine, family medicine, and pediatrics together, it's over half of all board certified physicians. But a lot of them aren't board certified, whereas in the radiologic professions, the proportion they're not board certified is fairly low. And these are just a couple of, now admittedly from 2004, but there's been a wealth of literature since then. Admittedly, some of it based on survey data, because at least in the radiologic professions, it's hard to get a control group that is really a valid control group, right? A comparison group. And with that in mind, we have to accept that the public's expectation of this is that board certification means something. I'd like to believe it does as well. But we have to admit it's difficult to scientifically validate that because the standard scientific methods we might use would be elusive when trying to demonstrate amongst multiple variables that the single variable of board certification is relevant. I mentioned this just because I think for a lot of our professionals, and I would argue for most of the people on this call, these are the things that motivate you. These are the things that bring you to work every day, and that is the ability to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose in what you do. And we try to make sure that the board certification process really is not at odds with that, to make sure that this idea of becoming better and better at something is important. And I've already several slides ago talked about this quest for excellence that's connected to a larger purpose. So these are the kinds of things that the board thinks about when it makes decisions about programs and policies, is to make sure that we're maintaining this high level, because it makes board certification mean something, and it means something not just to the professionals, but again to the patients and the public. So if I could summarize what the board does, remember, we're still talking about the why of board certification. We're going to get to the what in just a moment. But the value of board certification is proportional to the rigor of the process. If we want to be self-regulating, we need to do it well, or someone will take it over, and that someone could be the government. They could step in and say, well, we'll decide what constitutes board certification and what constitutes a qualified individual. So the point here is we want to be the ones making those decisions, whether we're, again, diagnostic radiologists, radiation oncologists, or medical physicists. And we are attempting, and I can speak for the board in this regard, we're trying to be relevant and reasonable. If we're not those two things, I think we lose the credibility with the diplomates and candidates, right? It's one thing to have credibility to the public, but if we're not relevant or reasonable, the candidates and diplomats start to wonder, well, then why do we exist? What about that why part of it? Let me move on to the how. And this is really about making the change to remote exams. We did that in a big way last year. In June of 2020, we realized that we couldn't predict what the pandemic was going to represent over time. And it was that uncertainty that really sort of told us, well, we're going to have to act. We can't wait for this to go away. And thankfully, of course, we didn't, because we're still dealing with it, as you all know, to some degree every day. And we don't know what the future holds in this regard. So we went ahead and said, okay, we need candidates to have the opportunity to progress through the pipeline toward board certification. It's important for joining a hospital staff. It's important for credentialing, et cetera. So with this in mind, that drove us to develop the remote exams, which is where we are today, and we'll get into those details in a moment. I get this question a lot, so the first bullet is just to address that. We did not design these as a temporary measure, and that was true from day one. We could have kind of gone into it and just said, look, just until the pandemic's over. And instead, we kind of said, well, let's see if this works, and that's the second bullet here. Let's continue it forever. Why wouldn't we do that? It's better for the candidates. No travel, no stress related to that. There's no cost related to that. There's no missed work. And so we're hoping that this continues to be successful, because we also view it as every exam as a pilot, meaning can we make it better? Can we address things that we didn't anticipate? And the hope is that we've done that so far, and we'll continue to do it. I won't go through all of the parameters we used when we were trying to design the remote exams. The two that matter the most to me, one is optimized candidate experience, and that includes the flexibility to take breaks during the exam day whenever an individual feels like doing that. Especially important to nursing mothers, for example, that there isn't this restriction about certain segments of the exam, that this is the ultimate in terms of flexibility. It also needed to have an opportunity to recover for connection disruptions, because we don't control your network nor your hardware. So we needed to be mindful of that. And then lastly, accommodation, not only for nursing mothers, I mentioned a moment ago, but also for individuals with disabilities. And then valid. So if the two things that matter the most, as I say on this list, the first four mattered too. It had to be secure, it had to be fair, it had to be practical and error-free, but it had to be an optimized experience. And then lastly, it had to be valid. That is credible to the public, because it was really related to that security issue. And it also needed, I think, to recognize the high level of achievement and accomplishment that all of you put into your training, which I think was a critical piece to this process. The location for our exams is it just has to meet some minimum requirements: reasonable internet connectivity, had to be private and free from interruptions. And when asked about details about this, we said, well, you can be in your home, in an office. You can't be sitting at Starbucks and do this. It's just not reasonable, even though their internet may be better than yours at home. The reality is that's just not a way you can do this. So this is a private exam, and that's really, I think, an important feature to this. That is that you're doing it by yourself. We also require that the desk or table be free from books and notes and a secondary device, et cetera. Again, this is, as you know, a closed book test. We get this question a lot: what will happen if I lose internet connection? It depends a little bit. Short outages, and most of the outages we have for individuals are just a few minutes. The bandwidth drops off, or there's even a power disruption and the router kicks out. So in this case, we can really recover those quite easily. We can give individuals back exam time that was lost. We can get them back into the exam. Longer outages are a little more troublesome, and we have those on occasion. The biggest change really in the exam experience for the platform itself is that we require that the individuals take items sort of in blocks of 20 items. The rationale there is that if you do have a power outage, you've saved your work up until that point, and it's not a matter of losing answers you have already entered. So that's just I believe, a relatively minor thing. Again, we're saving travel, we're saving the cost of travel and missed work, but one of the sacrifices is that we're going to require individuals to take content in blocks. We've been asked this as well. What about technical check to make sure that my hardware, my network, and any conflicting software has been addressed. We've tried to refine this, still working on it, but I think it's pretty good at this point. The idea here is that individuals can go in multiple times and make sure that their hardware works, that their software works, that everything is adequate with their network. And in fact, we encourage people go in with the same device and with the same network they're going to be using on exam day. Excuse me. We want it to be a comfortable process. We want it to be familiar to you, and we don't want this to be a stressful experience. Excuse me again. So what were some other enhancements or initiatives that we took on in the last couple of years, not related directly to remote exams? We instituted a residency leave policy that took effect in July of last year, which grants up to 40 days off per year, still subject to your local institution limits. But the key here is that as far as the ABR is concerned, you can miss up to 40 days a year and still graduate on time, which I think is an important feature. It's one of the more liberal policies among the ABMS boards. Details are on our website. We also will be introducing in 2022 an additional opportunity for the oral certifying exam. The main event is still in the spring that follows completion of training. So individuals for that exam completed training the previous year. They come back in the following calendar year in the spring, and this year it's in May. I take that back. That's actually in April this year. In April of 2022 will be the physics event, and then we'll have a second event in the fall, which I believe is in October, but I will invite my colleagues to correct me if I got that wrong. This additional event has limited capacity, but we are hoping to be able to host anyone who wants to take the exam. It is, of course, eligible for it at that time. We're also introducing more communication channels in 2022, including things like this town hall. I'm not sure exactly the frequency we're going to use. We're going to see how they go. But the idea is to make sure that we've given people opportunities to ask questions, tell us where we could be doing better. And if we could be doing things better, we want to know about it. Beyond that, we also send out a communication survey that is still active. And let us know how you want us to communicate with you. Do you prefer text to email or email to text? Do you prefer social media? What are the ways you want to be contacted regarding ABR activities? Because we don't know. We'd be guessing, right? We assume that you think like we do. Well, maybe not. Maybe there are preferences that you have that we don't know about. And that's what this communication survey is about. Let us know how we can best communicate with you so that we're not being intrusive or a burden, but at the same time that we're being as transparent and as open as we can be. This is fairly new information that we talked with the program director organization and basically said, when would you like the Part 1 exam? And many of you may know that it was changed to January not that long ago. And after discussion with stakeholders involved, including trainees and program directors, we said, look, we don't have a preference at the ABR. We'll do it whenever you like, but we need to make sure that it's at least representative of a consensus. So based on this, and I took this from their website just yesterday, I think it was posted quite recently, starting in 2023, we will be giving an exam in August. So you can see in 2023, there will be 2 exams, January and then again in August as we make this transition. And then it will be August beyond that time, because that was the preference of I suppose, the majority of people that were surveyed. But we were very grateful that SDAMP was willing to provide this information, because from the point of view of the ABR, it just didn't matter. It's just that we sort of needed to pick a time and stick with it every time we make these changes. It confuses people. And we want to be as steady as we can be. So starting in 2023, the second half of the year, we'll be giving this exam in August. I'm going to finish up with a word about our new DEI committee. This was designed primarily to address issues for candidates, and that is to make sure that they were confident that we were doing what we could to treat candidates fairly, and to make sure that as much as possible we were mindful of the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that might create discomfort for our candidates. And you see, we actually went beyond that and said we're also concerned about diplomats, volunteers, our staff, and the public. So this committee has met several times. It's fairly new. It's a committee of our trustees and our board members, and they've accepted this responsibility to address these issues as they relate, especially to exam experience and fairness, and more to come from that group as they get the momentum going in this regard. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'll share my email address again. Please, if something comes up to you later today, tomorrow, next month, don't hesitate to reach out. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and I'll stop sharing and turn things over to David for the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Wagner. We've already got a few questions that have come in. A reminder to the attendees, go ahead and enter any questions that you might have with the Q&A function that I outlined at the beginning of the webinar. Let's get to the first one. The first question is, I'm going to take the part 2 exam this August. Can I take the second oral test in October in that same year? Dr. Pogorsak, you want to take that one?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Andy, for that question. Eligibility for the oral exam, of course, suggests that you have passed the qualifying exams previously. So the first step, of course, is to pass the Part 2 exam. And once you do so, then at that point you become eligible for the certifying exam. Now, the way we have the certifying exam structured, one is not eligible to take 2 exams in any given year. In other words, once you complete Part 2, you then have to wait until a subsequent year in order to take the oral exam. So the answer to your question is no. If you pass the Part 2 qualifying exam this August, you will have to wait until next year in order to take the certifying exam. And there are some administrative reasons why that is the case, but that is the short answer to your question.
Great, thank you. A similar exam question. Is it allowed to take the Part 1 exam twice in 2023, since there will be the 2 administrations in 2023, January and August? Is it allowable to take it both times?
I'll go ahead and answer that one as well. Yes, I presume you wouldn't want to take it a second time if you passed it the first time. So the presumption, of course, is that you were not successful the first time. And if that's the case, then yes, in fact, you can take it again the second time that year.
Great. Next question showing here is, first of all, it was a comment. Thank you for this session, followed by a question. Is the only software needed for Part 2 Google Chrome? I can handle that one if you'd like. So at this moment, you actually would need Google Chrome, and then our third-party vendor that we use for helping monitor security is called Proctorio. You would need to install that Google Chrome app for Proctorio. Those are the only 2 things that you would need to take the Part 2 exam. In the future, we're looking at removing the need to use Proctorio. We're building those security monitoring tools into the ABR software rather than having to rely on a third-party vendor. But as of the Part 2 exam, probably this year, we don't know when that phase out is exactly going to occur. So you will need Google Chrome, likely with the Proctorio app added into Google Chrome, but it may be by August that we're able to sunset the third-party vendor that we're using now, and you would only need to just use Google Chrome. Great question. Next question is, can Part 2 registration be extended in 2023 for those taking Part 1 in January of the same year? Dr. Pogorsak or Dr. Ibbett?
Well, let me see if I can answer that, but I'm going to say first, I'm not sure that I understand the question. Certainly, when you pass part one, and if you take part one in January next year, which you can do, then this is a bit of an exception. You are eligible to take part two in August next year. And it's an artifact because we're offering part one in January. This will be the last time because as you heard a few minutes ago, it's going to move back to August. So next year, yes, you can take part one in January, and if you're successful, then you're eligible, provided you meet all of the other requirements for part two, then you would be eligible to take part two in August. Now, the eligibility period, what we refer to as board eligibility, begins when you've completed the requirements for part two. And the primary requirement is that you've completed a residency. And so your board eligibility clock begins when you've completed your residency, or if you are one of the candidates who entered the process before the 2014 date, then of course there are the other requirements of 36 months of experience. And likewise, if you're coming through a certificate program or an alternate pathway, there might be other requirements that apply. But the basic requirement is completing that residency. And then your board eligibility clock begins, and you have the number of years stated on our website to complete part two and successfully pass the oral exam. So, David, you were looking at the question. Does that seem like I've answered the question?
Yeah, I think you did, Dr. Ibbott. Thank you. The next question is there any time limit to take part two after you've passed part one? Dr. Ibbott, you want to handle that one as well?
I can, yes. And there is a time limit. We don't want you to go an unnecessarily long time between passing part one and taking part two. But we also recognize that people, at least a few years ago, were having a great deal of difficulty getting the clinical experience needed, either through the 36-month pathway that was available then, or by completing a residency. So we've allowed a 10-year period between completing part one, passing part one, and becoming board eligible.
Great. Thank you. Let's see here. Another good question here. If we lose connectivity for a brief moment during the part two exam, how can we reconnect? And is there an option to regain the time we lost? Dr. Wagner, you want to cover that one for us?
Sure. So it depends, as I said earlier, just a little bit on how much time was lost. We're very good at giving back the time that you lost. We're a little less effective at giving back all the questions that you might have seen but didn't answer, and that's one of the reasons we encourage people to answer as they go along, rather than sort of saving them up, if you want to put it that way. So I think as I say, the staff is very good. We know exactly when you basically had the outage, when you called us, and even if you're on hold, we credit that to you as well. We're not interested in shorting you out of the time that you're due. It's a little, as I say, a little more of a struggle to get back the questions that you might have seen, especially if that delay was prolonged. I hope that answers the question, but yeah, you can definitely do that. I see another question here, David, about the the 5 blocks, and this is kind of a related question, I guess.
Yeah, I've reached out to somebody because I don't know how many question blocks are in that exam. I'm trying
Well,
to
I don't know how
find
many
out.
blocks are. The blocks I'm fairly confident are 20 question blocks,
Okay.
so that it's as many blocks as it takes to cover 20 questions per block.
Yeah, and there's 129 questions in the Part 2 therapeutic exam,
so
130 in diagnostic, and 130 in nuclear.
So it's 7 blocks, I think, for all of those, if I did the math correctly. So so the key is, and I don't know if again, the reason for that is that we don't control sort of the security around, we wouldn't want to, I doubt it applies to anyone in this call, but people who they lose their connection and then they're tempted to look up an answer and then come back to that question later. That's why the blocks exist. It just says that while you're in that block, if you're going to take a break, basically what it means is you can't go back to content you've already seen. And that's, again, one of the prices that we pay. I think I alluded to that earlier, that one of the prices we pay is, in order to get the security back, we have to make sure that you don't return to content you've already seen, because the temptation would be to, well, can I recheck on question 43? I was a little uncertain about that one. If you've seen question 43, then answer it. And as long as you stay in the exam till the end of the block, you're fine. Once you move out of that answer is sort of fixed. Or if you take a break, the same thing would happen.
Great. Another question: how many times are we allowed to try Part 3? Dr. Pogorsak, you want to take that one on?
Sure, thank you. It's actually not technically a number of times that defines how many opportunities you have for Part 3, but it's more a time period between when you first became board eligible and when you actually complete successfully the oral exam. And I believe that time period is 6 years. So once you become board eligible, you have 6 years to, I guess the first step is pass the Part 2 qualifying exam, and then ultimately pass the certifying oral exam. So it's really 6 years from the time that most of you will complete your residency to the time that hopefully you will have completed your Part 3 exam.
Great, thank you. Another question. The 2020 oral exam was canceled due to the pandemic. Do our deadlines get extended by 1 year? Again, it's, I think, kind of following up on the board eligibility deadline. Dr. Ibbett, you want to handle that one?
I will. And that is an interesting question that has affected a lot of people. The answer is, if you are running out of time for any one of the exam cycles, Part 1 or the board eligibility time that Dr. Pogorsak just discussed, then you should contact us. We're not automatically extending timeframes because it may be completely unnecessary. We hope that you will be successful when you first take any of the exams, so an extension won't be necessary, and it won't be necessary for most candidates. But as I say, if you are running out of time, then contact us. And if the pandemic affected the number of opportunities you were given to take an exam, then we will certainly consider an extension.
Yeah, Jeff, if I could add, that's probably a moot point beyond this year, because we've offered ample opportunities. We'll be offering 4 opportunities in 2 years. So anyone who lost an opportunity in 20, let's, for example, let's say your board certification was due to expire in 2020, that was your last year. Obviously, we're not going to hold you to that. We're going to say, well, come back and take the exam in 2021. But if you're due to expire in 2023, this disruption of the pandemic will not result in an extension, because in effect it had no impact. And you could argue that, in fact, there are far more opportunities now that we're at 2 exams per year for the Part 3 to allow you to do that. So so Jeff's right. We'll weigh it on an individual basis, but in general, we're applying that criteria. We don't want the pandemic to adversely impact someone's board certification status, but at the same time, if there was an opportunity to make up those lost opportunities from 2020, sort of the non-exam year, then we're kind of back to square one. I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of the way we're looking at it in the office.
Great. And another question, in the oral exam, are we allowed to see the examiner's camera? Dr. Simile, you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure, just to confirm, it's asking if, as an examiner, you'll be able to see your examiner's face during the exam. Is that the
Right.
question?
Correct.
Yes. So your examiner will be able to see you, and you will be able to see your examiner. You're able to move kind of the window for where your examiner is around your screen, so you can move it out of the way if you find it distracting. If you find it helpful, maybe there's some nonverbal cues in there, you can leave it, in the center of your screen or off to the side.
Great. Right. Let's see here. Another question here. In light of the labor shortage in medical physics across the country, does the ABR plan to raise the passing rate of Part 3? Dr. Ibbott, you want to take that one on?
I will, and I'm sure Dr. Wagner might have a comment there too, but no, the answer is no. We understand the concern, but we are maintaining our standards. And as Dr. Wagner said a few minutes ago, it is critical that for the ABR to maintain relevance and credibility, we have to maintain those standards. And that's true not just of the Part 3 oral exam, but of the other exams as well, where the passing level is set by committees who evaluate the difficulty of each question through a process known as the Angolf method and determine a passing score that way. So we will maintain our standards.
Yeah, Jeff, and thanks. That's about as succinctly as it could be said, so I'll make it less succinct. But if there was an interest in addressing the labor shortage, then you should train more medical physicists. I say you, I don't know who would actually make that decision, but that would work, because then we would still maintain the standard, and we don't decide what the passing rate is. So I'm going to get to the kind of the second part of the question. We don't decide on a number and then adjust that number. As Jeff alluded to, we have a standard, and I think, having been an oral examiner for diagnostic radiology some years ago, when we still had an oral exam, we didn't go in. You went in with, okay, we know what a passing candidate looks like, and for the most part, people fell into those two divisions. I mean, there were still people on the borderline, but the bottom line is the standard was the standard, and there was no set rate of passage, if you want to call it that, where we were going to decide, hey, we have to pass 90% or 80% or whatever that number might be. It's not even a mechanism that we have.
Perfect. Thank you. I think should take care of that one. Next question is a comment with a question. I understand the benefits of remote exam, but are there any chances that on-site exams will be given as an option in the future? Dr. Wagner, you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's a great question, because this has come up before. For people especially, we had a few people struggle with the technology, and to the point where they couldn't finish their exam. It was actually very rare. We were more than 99% successful. So 99 times out of 100, if a candidate started the exam, they finished the exam. But we did have a handful where we couldn't resolve their technical issues, or one had a power outage. We had people who their camera failed, they didn't realize it, that kind of thing. So in a perfect world, you'd say, okay, go to one of the test centers and we'll let you take the test there, where we have probably a more reliable, certainly bandwidth. The security environment is not an issue, so there's no need to worry about the camera that we use to maintain that secure environment in your home or your office. The problem is that to code it separately and to be able to offer both of these options is a challenge, and it's expensive. So for the time being, we're not looking at that option because of what it would cost to actually code the exam in those two different ways. The one area where we could consider it is basically if you could find a test site that would allow you to bring a computer in. As far as I know, that doesn't exist, where you could at least be in a test center and be secure. But I'm glad you raised the question because we're constantly looking at ways to make this better. And if we could provide that flexibility, I think we should. And we'll continue to look at that. Maybe there, as our software evolves, we may come to a point where we can say, yeah, if a candidate wants to go to a test center, I suppose that's possible. There's nothing about the exam itself that prevents that. It's the platform that we're using that is the problem. David, do you have anything to add to that? Did I cover that okay? Because you know a little bit about this, or a lot about this as well.
Yeah, you covered it nicely. Nothing really from my perspective to add to that. Thanks, Dr. Wagner. A question about exam dates. So that it's, I'm just going to read it. Just make sure I include everything. Have you considered changing the Part 2 exam date? August is a bad time as the test occurs 1 month after graduating residency, where you would presumably be starting a new job. It's very difficult to get time off to study, take the exam so soon after starting a new job. It may be better to take Part 2 while still in a residency. Dr. Pogorsak, thoughts on that?
Sure. That's a very good point, Colin. And what I'll mention is that our exams are scheduled in such a way that the candidates that are sitting for the exam have the best possible opportunity to be successful. And part of that requires that the candidate will have seen all of the material that they are going to be tested on. And the Part 2 exam is essentially the first exam that a candidate takes once he or she becomes board eligible. So really, having the exam during the residency, which I completely understand would help from the perspective of the upheaval of starting your first job after graduating the residency and trying to study during that time, you may be taking the exam prior to seeing all of the material that you will be tested on. So really, it wouldn't be a very good, I guess, choice for us to have the exam prior to the candidate completing the residency. Now, there is always opportunity for discussion and potentially moving it further along in the year, but that's something that we haven't addressed at this point, nor is it something that we're currently looking at. Does that answer the question, David?
I believe it does, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jeff, did you have anything to add, or Brent, to that?
No.
Okay.
But maybe we could ask Dr. Samili for her perspective, as having gone through the process much more recently than any of us.
In terms of the scheduling of the Part 2 exam,
Yes.
so for me personally, I was in an off-cycle residency program and I finished August 30th, which allowed me to sit for the August exam that year. It was possible to take the exam with a month remaining. Usually residency programs have a month or so at the end that's flexible. But it did feel a bit like a risk when I took it, not knowing if, maybe I hadn't seen everything yet. And so I do think having it after residency, just from a content perspective, makes sense. Although I also can understand the benefit or value of having it just prior to finishing the residency program.
Great, thank you. Another question about Part 1 exams this year. Will there be a second Part 1 exam offered in 2022? So we just had the January one. Will there be another administration this year? Dr. Pogorsak, do you want to handle that one as well?
No, there will not. The next administration will be January of next year. And then, as Dr. Wagner mentioned, Next year, there will actually be 2 Part 1 exams, the second one in August, and then in subsequent years, it will remain in the August timeframe. So no additional Part 1 exam this year.
All right. Another question about multiple exams in a year. If an individual were to fail the Part 3 certifying oral exam this spring, are they eligible to take it in October of this year?
I can answer that one as well. Yes, any candidate that will either condition or fail the certifying exam, the oral exam in April of this year, is eligible to retake the either full exam or condition exam in October of this year.
Great, thank you. Next question, since there have been 2 exams the past couple of years as well as the next year for Part 1, is it not possible to have a second exam in August? So it's kind of a follow-up question from somebody else, but along those same lines. Maybe Brent, Dr. Wagner would want to handle that one.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of work for our volunteers, and they are being stretched pretty thin as we try to double up these exams. In fact, even that change to include 2 exams in 2023 for Part 1, meant that extra content had to be developed in effect. Now it kind of stretches out over time, so it's not as big a deal. But for us to just add an extra exam just isn't possible. I think we've asked an awful lot of the volunteers to write the content. The content is excellent. And that's the limit. We just don't have that. That's the constraint we're operating under, is we just don't have, I think, the capacity to develop an exam twice a year. We did it. In fact, even when we did it in 2021, that actually was the 2020 exam that was held over into 2021. So the 2 administrations in 2021 was, we had kind of this catch up, and then the other one. But the reality is, it was still it's still a burden, and I think an unrealistic burden for us to tell the volunteers you need to generate twice as much content in order to have a unique exam event. So that's why we don't have, because on the surface of it, you're right, it makes sense. Why wouldn't we just offer 4 exams a year or 3 exams a year to give people maximum flexibility? We can do it with the orals. It's tougher where there has to actually be authored content that is vetted by the committees in order to make that happen.
Great, thank you. A question about kind of certification pathways and processes. Is there any discussion or plan to adjust the process for becoming certified in a second discipline? For example, being certified in diagnostic medical physics first, and then subsequently nuclear medical physics after that. The comment is, the current process is well established and understood, but in some ways also limiting to easily achieve second certification. Dr. Ibbott, care to respond to that one?
Yes, I will. Thank you, David. Well, we understand this, and I'm not being clever here, but of course, it's not our goal to make it easy to become certified. It's our goal to make certification a clear indication of qualifications. So the direct answer to your question is that no, we don't have any plans to change the process. I think that we've made it as straightforward but as flexible also as we can. And to perhaps very briefly summarize for people who are not familiar with the process, if you're certified in one discipline of medical physics, then by conducting a training period of 1 year in a second discipline, then you become eligible to take the Part 2 qualifying exam and subsequently the Part 3 oral certifying exam in that second discipline. I don't know how we could make that easier for a candidate to go through that pathway without reducing the significance and the value of that certification. But if you have suggestions, and to the person who wrote this comment or others who are interested, if you do have specific suggestions, I'm sure we'd be glad to hear them.
Great, thank you. Another question about the timing for the Part 3 exam. What was the reasoning for moving the Part 3 exam to April? Sounds like some concerns about the communication of that prior to the change. Dr. Pogorczak, you want to handle that one?
Sure. Thank you, David. The exam traditionally has always been given in the kind of mid to late May timeframe. And because of operational issues associated with ABR staff, resource utilization, and other aspects that are important for us to deliver a remote oral exam, for medical physics, it was decided, at least for this year, and more than likely in subsequent years as well, that the first oral exam will be in the April timeframe. Now, that's not to say that in any given year in the future, it may not spill over into early May, but I think we've pretty much landed on the timeframe where we traditionally have always been with the certifying exam.
If I could, Matt, if I could add to that, one of the reasons we moved it forward, and I don't know if this was the major reason or not, was to increase the interval between the spring exam and the fall exam, so that for candidates who fail the spring exam, it gave them adequate preparation time to then have a wider gap. So it's almost exactly 6 months. There was a chance, for example, that there could be a late May exam and then a late August exam in the fall, and late summer, obviously, but that second event. And we had a long discussion about that. In order to be fair to the candidates, we said, well, let's move that event further forward. Obviously you're out of training anyway. It's not getting into the way of training. And but then give people the best shot at saying, okay, I got my exam, I didn't do well, I got some feedback, I know what I need to address, and then come back and have another try at it. Without making that window 90 days, we tried to make it closer to 6 months. Yeah. Incidentally, I'll answer another question while I have the floor. This 2 exams per year, we expect to continue into 2023 and beyond. So it depends on how it works, but that's the expectation, is that we'll be administering 2 of the oral Part 3 exams annually at about those same intervals for the foreseeable future.
Thanks for the additional information, Dr. Wagner. So we're getting close to the end of the session, but do have time for a few more questions. So the next question is, the pandemic has affected many people in different ways. Some people might, for example, suffer from long COVID symptoms, or perhaps folks on locums contracts might need time to find a different job at the beginning of the pandemic, etc. Is there any chance that the board will look at extending the deadlines for certain people? Dr. Ibbett, you want to handle that one?
I will. Well, we certainly try to be understanding, and we recognize that people have a number of important life events that might occur during their training and during the certification process. So when these things happen, we accommodate when we can. So we do, for example, accommodate people with disabilities or other issues in all of our exams, but for example, the Part 3 oral exam. So if long COVID affects someone's ability in an oral exam situation, then we would do what we could to accommodate that. I'm not sure that we would necessarily extend the time frame of the overall process, but I suppose it would depend on the circumstances. And related to COVID, there's a lot that we haven't dealt with in the past. Maybe Dr. Wagner, you could fill in any gaps I left there.
No, I think that's exactly right. You know, we'll take every consideration. It's just that we have to be reasonable, and there's a reason, there's a time limit to become board certified. That's actually handed down by ABMS. We don't have a whole lot of latitude with that. But that said, we'd be glad to hear any concerns in that regard and see what we can do.
Great, thank you. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, the end of the scheduled time for this session. We do have a few questions that haven't been answered that aren't repeats, so we'll look at those questions and make sure that we get those addressed either through a blog or some other means just to make sure we're following up the way. And also, if you have questions regarding something specific, you can always reach out to our certification managers. We have a great group of folks that's always available to take phone calls and emails. The phone number is 520-790-2900. And then the email address is information@theabr.org. And both of those pieces of information are also available on our website. Any closing comments from the panelists as we wrap this up?
I just want to say thank you again. We appreciate it, and thanks for all the good questions. They're terrific. I think they point to areas we need to communicate better, but more importantly, it shows a level of engagement with the process that I find very gratifying. So thanks for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at some point in the future.
Have a good night, everyone.